The exception is a class here. So here everything is going to be class and we are not going to see any interfaces. Here exception is also a class and we have another class which is called as error. Right? So this is the root class and this is the exception class and this is the error class. And again there are so many classes that is extending this particular exception class. So before proceeding further, we must understand what is the difference between an exception and the difference between exception and an error in Java. Right? This understanding is required. If anyone is asking you what is an exception, we can simply say that exception is an unexpected or unfortunate event that is getting that will be occurring when we are trying to execute a program. When you don't expect that, like it is going to terminate the program, it will go to just terminate the program and remaining logics or remaining statements that has to be get executed will not be executed. Right? It is an unexpected event that will occur in Java. But one thing you must understand, exception is always recoverable. What do you mean by this? Java exceptions are always recoverable. Always recoverable. And you can also say that it is always caused by the developers. So because we may be missing something in the logic, so the logic that we are adding up is going to generate any kind of exception. So we have already seen a few exceptions. One is like arithmetic exception. If you are trying to execute a code which says 10 by 0, it is going to generate an arithmetic exception. So this is something that has to be taken care by the developer only. The developer responsibility to take care of this exception. Right? So whatever the exception that is caused or that is created by the developer, knowingly or unknowingly, it is always recoverable. You can developers are capable to handle these exceptions. It is not going to cause any harm to the program if it is handled properly. Right? But errors are not recoverable. If you try to understand, you try to deep dive into the errors are something that is not in the developer's control. Right? So let us take a small analogy. Errors are like, for example, if you are having a 32-bit operating system and you have a RAM size of 4 GB RAM size you have, right? So this 4 GB RAM size is completely, just imagine that it is completely occupied by many applications. Your 4 GB RAM is occupied by many applications, and if you are trying to execute a Java program on your RAM, on your machine, whenever you are trying to execute a program or whenever you are trying to perform any operation in your system, it is going to consume some memory from your RAM for the temporary memory allocation. Right? Just imagine that your RAM is already occupied with many applications, and on top of it you are trying to execute a Java program. So for example, if your Java code is going to consume 1 GB of memory and your RAM is already occupied with many applications, is there any way for you to execute this Java code which is going to occupy 1 GB of memory? There is no way for the Java code to get executed, right? So this is called an error. The error is something that is happening in the system. It is not in the developer's control. It depends upon the machine. Right? Out of memory is something that you cannot even what we call it as expect this. This is something not in your control. It's not like, okay, if you got out of memory, it is not like you can just increase the memory size just like that. You cannot do that. Depends upon the RAM, because RAM is fixed in size, isn't it? It is not in our control. So that's why we say that errors are not recoverable. If you ask me what are the errors that we often face in the system, we can say out of memory error. out of memory error we have another something like if JVM is attacked, virus is not under your control. Any hacker can inject a virus in your JVM, Java Virtual Machine. Any hacker, there are high chances that if your system is not secured or if your data can be breached, any hacker can inject a virus. Virus is also not in your control. If your system is attacked with virus, it is something that cannot be handled by the developer. It is something that has to be looked after. Looked after in the sense it cannot be controlled by the program. It has to be either your system needs a replacement or your RAM, your memory. When we talk about RAM, we talk about memory. So your RAM needs an expansion, or the affected system needs a replacement, or you have to run an antivirus software, which is not a program control. Obviously, developer has nothing to do with that. So these things are called as errors. Sometimes we can say if your program is occupying 1 GB of memory, if you are having only 500 MB of free space, you are lacking system resources. So these things actually cause errors. Things are causing errors, right? And it is not recoverable as well, right? So if you talk about exceptions are always recoverable, and there is always a way to make sure that exceptions are not getting occurred, right? One of the ways is that we can use the exception handling mechanism, but errors are not like that. Once errors are occurred, you cannot deal the errors with the what we call it as the programs. There should be a replacement. I mean, it is not completely, it is not in our control. In simple words, I can say errors are completely out of control. It is not in our control. Errors are not under your control. Right? Second point, what we can say, it is not recoverable. And if you apply the same thing to the exceptions are under your control. What do you mean by under your control? It means it is controllable. I mean, developers has some they can implement some logics to handle these exceptions. That's why it is under control. It is recoverable. So this is the simple difference between exception and an error. Alright. So again, I am saying this exception is a subclass of what? Subclass of throwable class. So throwable is the superclass. Under throwable class, one of the classes is exception class, and the other class is error class. And there are so many subclasses under this exception class and under the error class. Right? I hope you are able to understand what is an error, what is an exception. Right? These things could give you the perfect description, which are exception are under control, under programmer's control, it is recoverable. Errors are not under the programmer's control, it is not recoverable. These are the examples of an exception. Virus attack, errors. I mean to say errors. These are the examples of an error. Virus attack. You can also say out of memory is not in your control. Virus attack and lack of system resources. Right? Exceptions are something that is visually seen and visually understood. And visually, you can able to fix that. You can able to fix a exception immediately, but errors cannot be fixed immediately. It needs a complete replacement. Right? So let's proceed with what are the subclasses under exception. You need to understand them. So let me write the subclasses of the exception class. And again, similarly, like we have seen in Java collections, these same things are going to be here. The collection framework, there are many number of classes and interfaces that are connected to each other. Likewise, under exceptions and errors, there are a lot of classes. So this is exception class. So under exception class, we have so many classes, so many subclasses, I can say. One is These things are very important. We are going to learn each and every exception class for the better understanding. This is runtime exception. Second one is IO exception. IO exception is nothing but input output exception. And we have interrupted. So the last one, I mean, there are so many exception class, but this exception class that we often see, we often see this exception class, remote exception, right? And again, run in the under the runtime exception, we have many exception classes. Let me write one by one. First one is arithmetic exception. Right, under arithmetic exception, I mean, arithmetic exception is a separate exception, and we have null pointer exception. And we have index out of bound exception. And we have, let me say, a number format exception. So these are the subclasses that is available under the runtime exception class. So here everything is a class. Not get confused. Everything is a class. There are no interfaces. Everything is a class. So under runtime exception, we have arithmetic exception, we have null pointer exception, we have index out of bound exception, and again under index out of bound exception, we have array index out of bound exception, and we have string index out of bound exception. Let me write that as well. Array index out of bound. Out of bound exception. Right, these two exceptions are just under index out of bound exception. So index out of bound exception is the parent class for this, for these two specific exceptions, I can say. Right. So under IO exception, again we have two classes. One is a file not found exception. This is the one of the important exception that we often come across. File not found exception. The last second one is EOF exception. EOF means end of the file exception. When we will also come across this exception sometimes, not very often. Right. So these are the under runtime exception. We have arithmetic exception, we have null pointer exception, we have index out of bound exception, we have number format exception. Specifically under index out of bound exception, we have two classes, which is array index of bound and string index out of bound exception. Right. So under input output exceptions, we have two classes. One is a file not found exception. Second one is EOF exception. Right. And you can just connect this because exception class is the parent of all these exceptions. Anyone is asking you what are the classes that are under exception class, you can say runtime exception. These are the subclasses: runtime exception, IO exception, interrupter exception, remote exception. And actually there should not be any spaces because it is class specific. So you just remove the spaces, okay? And under this runtime arithmetic null pointer index out of bound, specifically under index out of bound, and again there are two classes, subclasses, which is array index, index, and number pointer. And we have under IO exception. We ask me, these are the only exceptions that we have in Java. No, there are many exceptions. These exceptions that we often come across. So if you understand this exception, the handling remaining exceptions is going to be a cakewalk. It is going to be very easy, right? Now, so far we have discussed about the exception, like under exception, these are the classes that are under exception, right? And again, we have to understand what are the few common errors. And what are the classes that will be coming under the error class, right? Let me write that as well. So let me take error class. Error. So under error we have virtual machine error. First class is going to be virtual machine error. So under this virtual machine is nothing but an imaginary machine. We can say that stack overflow. Stack overflow error. We have already discussed about stacks in the exception handling as well as in the arrays. So when the memory in the stack is overflowed, you get this error as an exception. As an error, output will be stack overflow error. You don't call this as an exception because it is not under the developer's control. It is something that is physically, that is what imaginarily and out of developer's control. So we have stack overflow, we have out of memory error. So these are the two classes that is available under virtual VM error. And again we have linkage error. That's it. This knowledge is enough. So under error class there are two subclasses. One is virtual machine error, second one is linkage error. So under virtual machine error we have stack overflow error, we have out of memory error. So these things you will have to understand these things one by one. At the same time, it is also imperative to memorize these things because not just for the memory. So we will be able to track what exception does a program really throws. So we need that idea. We need to develop that intuition. So it is okay to memorize all these things. If you're not memorizing, also no problem. But you should be able to differentiate the exceptions that are under runtime exception, the exceptions that are IO exception. This differentiation we will be understanding going forward. So what does it mean exactly arithmetic exception? What is null pointer exception? We understand the differences between each and every exception. Then I don't think memorization is also required. It is not required. So before proceeding further, you must know the simple understanding about what is exception and what is error. We have already discussed that. The next topic is going to be, so this is one of the famous interview questions. What are checked exceptions and unchecked exceptions? What are the checked exceptions and unchecked exceptions in Java? Usually, if you look at into the, and if you are asked to tell the theory part, it is very simple. Checked exceptions, they usually say that checked exceptions are the compile time exceptions and unchecked exceptions are the runtime exceptions. So this is what the theory is when you search for this question in any website, right? They say before even understanding this, let us understand the simple hierarchy. So let us imagine that we are writing a piece of Java code in an editor. So here I am going to use the editor as Notepad, right? After writing the piece of Java code in my editor, I am going to transfer this to the compiler. After that, I am going to load this compiled file to the JVM. After this, the JVM is going to convert this to the native code, and the output will be displayed to the console. So this is the these are the stages that a code has to go through. We know this already, right? So here, pay some attention. So this is the notepad, simple notepad. In the notepad, I have written a Java code. So I have to save this Java file as a.java. I mean, class name.java. I'm assuming that the name of the class is A. I'm saving this as a.java. Right. After this, I am sending this file to the compiler. Just assume that this is a compiler. The job of the compiler is to check if the code is drafted successfully. The code has any syntactical errors. What do you mean by syntactical errors? Syntactical error in the sense if the code has any spelling mistakes, if the data types are properly structured, right? The compiler is always going to check for the errors. You must understand.